Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia. This is Season 3, the Aymara Revolution, and Episode 3, Autonomy and Bishop Arias. I am Reverend David Stevenson.
The next several episodes are extremely controversial. Many, especially former U.S. Methodist missionaries and their families, aren't really going to want to hear what these episodes say. And you have to keep in mind what I've said about cultural elitism. It's not racism, it's cultural elitism. I'm going to let them do the talking as much as possible. This is a history that few people, even very few indigenous Bolivian Methodists, truly know. Former missionaries have put their spin on these events over the past 5 decades. And I feel it's important that the indigenous voices need to be heard. It should bring pride that they have had the courage to follow God in bringing autonomy, independence, and equality within the IEMB. And, as we shall see, there are those who believe it laid the foundation for the indigenous revolution of 2006, which ended the Hacienda Patron apartheid rule in the nation of Bolivia.
In 1956, Murray Dixon and others pushed the Worldwide General Conference of the Methodist Church to designate Bolivia as the, quote, land of decision, unquote, making it the focus of missions for the entire Methodist Church. As with all movements, there were multiple reasons why Bolivia was chosen. Of course, Murray and many of the missionaries in Bolivia felt that the Methodist Church could have a great impact on Bolivia and bring many new persons to Christ. But there was another reason that is commonly believed among Methodists in Bolivia. Rolando Villena was a mestizo who aligned himself with the indigenous movement during the Aymara Revolution of the IEMB. And I believe it was 1978, the General Assembly of the IEMB elected him bishop. Rolando Villena became the second bishop after the Aymara Revolution. Oddly enough, after fighting for indigenous control of the IEMB, while their first bishop was Aymara, their second bishop that they elected was a mestizo. He was the president of the Human Rights Commission of Bolivia in 2006 and had fought for indigenous rights most of his life. In fact, after the 2006 election of an indigenous president for the country, the president asked him to become the, quote, defender of the people, unquote, a new role within the government, to have someone be an advocate for indigenous rights and a protector of civil liberties. And he remained an IEMB pastor until his death in 2021. Bishop Villena told me in a phone call, said, quote, the missionaries that came to Bolivia was in the years in which it was declared the land of decision. You'll remember what was the reason. It stimulated or challenged the United Methodist Church of the USA to become a mission in Latin America. It was to stop the advance of communism that Fidel Castro was exporting from his island. Evidently, there was already a clear mission that had responded by building in some way barriers of containment to socialism promoted by Fidel Castro that had gained relative success on the island of Cuba. Sending missionaries at this stage played an important role in containing communism. He continued to say, so it is a decisive moment because at the same time there were several missionaries who were clearly responding, most of them, to this missionary goal. But there were also pastors from the Methodist Church of Argentina and Uruguay who, being part of the same conference, had the possibility of coming to Bolivia as a church and a country that was in formation. To put it more clearly, they were given the enormous challenges of having a Methodist church in Bolivia with a high indigenous component. That was important, unquote. I later had this view that the Land of Decision missionaries was at least partially motivated by Methodists wanting to contain communism. I confirmed it with the former U.S. ambassador to Bolivia, Ed Core. Ed told me how much he appreciated the IEMB when he was the ambassador to Bolivia under President Reagan in the early 1980s. He told me that the indigenous movements within Bolivia, which were separate from the communist movement, is what kept Bolivia from becoming communist, and that the IEMB was one of the key factors in keeping Bolivia from turning communism. So at least one of the motives for the U.S. Methodist missionaries to support the Aymara movement was to provide a middle path as an alternative to communism. The declaration of Bolivia as the land of decision by the United Methodist Church in 1956 led to a wave of missionaries coming to Bolivia. And for the next 13 years, more than 60 missionaries from the United States and other South American countries moved to Bolivia. Most missionaries stayed in the cities, and however, many missionaries struck out into these medium-sized rural towns whose populations were still primarily Mestizo. The patrons would often have a hacienda built in one of these towns, which was near to their land. Yet they were still close to their vast farmlands, yet had the conveniences of a small town and the socialization with the other patron families. Ancarimas, Achicaya, and many other towns are examples of this.
This brought about much greater contact between U.S. missionaries and the indigenous who lived in these towns, and some of the indigenous began to attend worship and even join the church. But there was still a problem, because the indigenous to this day say that missionaries came in power.
There was no organizational leadership among the indigenous laity of the Methodist Church. I'm sure the Mestizo and missionary leadership felt it wasn't necessary to help them start up. Everything was fine with the organized urban middle-class Mestizo leadership within the church. Many of the missionaries at the time were very intentional in preparing Bolivian leadership to take over responsibility for administering the church. Working ourselves out of a job was a common phrase. However, because of the sheer number of foreign missionaries in Bolivia, there weren't too many jobs left. Conference leadership positions, district superintendents in the urban areas, etc., were filled by all of these 60 U.S. missionaries and a few Mestizo pastors. The only jobs left
For the indigenous pastors were to serve local churches in the campo or rural areas. There were some efforts to encourage the recruitment of Aymara pastors, but
the focus was on training the Hispanic Mestizo Methodists to take over. First of all, the Mestizos could get a high school diploma, and many were recruited while they were still students at the American Institutes and other Methodist-run schools. But I also have little doubt that paternalistic attitudes toward the indigenous and the belief that the indigenous were incapable of running the church or any large organization played a significant role in promoting the Hispanic Mestizo Methodists over the indigenous Methodists. There may have also been some lingering cultural elitism involved.
in 1966, there was so much confusion as to what was going on in the IEMB in terms of membership. The IEMB asked GBGM to help them to find out exactly what was going on within the church. So jointly, they hired Dr. John Hickman, an anthropologist, to conduct research studies and surveys on the work process of the Methodist Church in Bolivia to evaluate what was really going on within the church. His report came in 1967 and came as no surprise to the Aymara pastors, but it was a shock to the Mestizo and Criollo pastors. Hickman wrote, "At the end of 1964, the membership included 2,433 members in full communion. Of that number, there were 1,326, or 54.5%, were Aymara speaking, and 1,107, or 45.5%, were Castilian or Spanish speaking. At the end of 1966, the membership had grown to 3,480 full members. Of this number, 2,227, or 61%, were Aymara speaking, and 1,253, or 36%, were Castilian-speaking. The church had grown by 1,047, or 43%, in just 2 years between 1964 and 1966. But 87% of this growth came from the Aymara people and only 13% from the Castilian-speaking people.
And then this damning statement by the researcher Hickman, quote, "Only one member of the Aymara people is a Bolivian member of the General Meeting. The others come from Spanish-speaking middle class." Did you get that? Only one indigenous person had a vote at the General Assembly of 1966, despite the indigenous representing 61%
Of the IEMB membership.
Hickman concludes, interpreting this data, we can show that growth of the Methodist membership had emerged from the Aymara people, but the control and direction of the church was in the hands of the Castilian or Spanish-speaking minority. In addition, the church leaders who belonged to that minority were from the cities, with an orientation and education of urban middle class and speak Spanish. The Aymara majority came from an original peasant tradition, with a mixture of traditional and the modern, with a poor and deficient education compared to the Spanish-speaking membership. However, as it grew progressively, the affiliation, especially in the rural areas, also was forming a conscious leadership of both national reality and the reality of the IEMB. Hickman's report shows that there was some emerging leadership from the Hispanic Mestizo pastors, but little from the indigenous. The exception were the 7 Aymara pastors trained in the Wesley Seminary in Montero. They potentially could become the core of the Aymara Methodist leadership group. Despite these imperfections in the autonomy of the IEMB, it was still an exciting time for the church as it began its journey to become a truly Bolivian church. The North and South American missionaries had already pushed and got South American Methodist churches to have their own missionary conference, the Rio de la Plata Conference, which allowed them to elect their own bishops. But many of the countries wanted to have their own separate denominations without any control from New York, and they hoped that if they walked the line carefully, they wouldn't lose funding from the North. Meanwhile, the indigenous Methodists in Bolivia, who were the majority of the membership, still had very few leaders and virtually no voice in all the decisions that were made by the church. With the help and the guidance of missionaries and the Criollo pastors, the first seminary class, made up primarily of indigenous persons, began in 1966 with 25 students. Only 7 students graduated. I've mentioned them before: Martin Hilary, Asensio Chocolo, Mario Salguero, Freddy Cuevas, Felipe Sacedo, and Simon Cespedes, who's Quechua. Felipe and the others graduated, and 3 years later they were accepted as national pastors at the historic First Autonomous General Assembly of 1969. These 7 pastors formed the unofficial but basically the central leadership of the Aymara Methodists, who would soon push for full independence from New York. At the 1966, 1967, and 1968 annual conferences, Felipe and the other indigenous students were invited to attend as observers. At the 66th conference, a group of Mestizo Methodists brought up the idea of gaining complete autonomy from the Methodist Church so that it could achieve, quote, self-support, self-direction, and self-propagation, positively a self-identity and self-existence. This was at a time where there was great international pressure against colonialism, and this was seen as an important step for the church to become a truly independent Bolivian national church. And sure enough, at the General Conference of the United Methodist Church in 1968, complete autonomy was granted to every national church that wished to have it. So in 1969, Bolivia became technically a completely independent church.
Thus, the Methodist mission was nationalized in the country, and from this unprecedented achievement, the IEMB was theoretically completely autonomous and sovereign to decide as to their own individual authorities, their structures, and its lifestyle. The leadership of the Methodist Church eventually passed into the hands of pastors and Bolivian lay in the national church,
the IEMB took its first step toward developing a truly autonomous Bolivian Methodist Church by declaring its full independence from the United Methodist Church and established a new constitution and structure which fit better to the culture of Bolivia. And to add to the historical nature of the conference, the Aymara 7, the first 7 indigenous IEMB students, graduated from the seminary in Montero, and they became ordained pastors. But what Philippe remembers most about the conference was that there were more missionaries from the U.S. and other South American countries who were voting delegates than there were Bolivians. There were very few indigenous delegates. There were 42 delegates to the founding General Assembly of 1969. Now, it's difficult to say who is, quote, indigenous, unquote, and who is, quote, mestizo, unquote. After 400 years of coexistence, being mestizo or indigenous is more a matter of whom you identify with than your actual bloodlines.
Retired Bishop Eugenio Poma and I looked over the list to determine how many delegates were either Aymara or Quechua. Eugenio was one of the lay delegates to the conference. Together, we figured out that there were about 9 lay delegates who were either Aymara or Quechua, and there were 4 pastors who were Aymara.
Philippe and one other indigenous delegate to the 69 founding General Assembly told me that several of the, quote, indigenous, unquote, delegates were fully indigenous persons, but were urban middle-class persons who identified themselves with the mestizos. There was no more than 10 or so truly rural, poor, indigenous persons at the assembly.
I suspect that number is pretty accurate because his number corresponds really well with Eugenio's memory, who was actually there as one of the late.
Quote, the Constitutional Assembly of the IEMB in 1969 set up its own constitution, which had some oddities built in, particularly when it came to who would be voting members of the newly supposedly independent IEMB. First, the U.S. and South American missionaries working in Bolivia were members in their home churches and annual conferences. Yet they were also allowed to be voting members of the newly supposedly autonomous IEMB. Normally, they would be voting members of one or the other.
And there was that additional unusual rule, which I mentioned in the previous episode, about missionary wives also having a vote at the annual conference.
The only purpose of this rule, it seems to me, is to double the voting power of the missionaries and double the influence of GBGM over the voting.
On November 28, 1969, the 54th and last session of the Bolivian Annual Conference for the Methodist Church met in Cochabamba to discuss and develop a new structure and constitution. And at 11:30 a.m. on November 29, 1969, the Bolivian Annual Conference voted to dissolve the conference and created the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia and held the first General Assembly as a newly independent church. With this historic event, the Methodist mission in Bolivia was nationalized, and the IEMB became autonomous and sovereign to decide its own authorities, personnel, structure, and lifestyle. Leadership passed into the hands of Bolivian pastors and laity, although fraternal and cooperative ties were maintained with the United Methodist Church. Since 1906, when the Methodist movement became established in the country, the largest part of the work was in the charge of representatives of the Board of Missions of the Church in the United States. And from there came the missionaries, the money, and even the decisions were already made for the work in Bolivia. But now, finally, Methodist ministry in Bolivia would be controlled by the church in Bolivia, not in the United States. According to Mamani's book, there were 19 lay delegates and 13 pastors and 10 U.S. missionaries as voting members. Of those 42, only 13 were indigenous. This despite the fact that the indigenous were now the majority of the membership of the IEMB. Now, this first autonomous General Assembly of the IEMB is one of the truly contentious and controversial General Assemblies in IEMB history. I have had the child of a missionary tell me that, quote, there were many indigenous delegates at the assembly, unquote. However, the documents show that there were maybe at the most 13 indigenous delegates, plus or minus one or two. And Eugenio Poma, who was there, estimated that there were no more than 10 or so. I suspect the difference comes from U.S. missionary families who mistakenly included urban mestizos who looked indigenous when they reflected back on the event, or there were many more indigenous Methodists who were there to watch this historic event but were not voting delegates. But now that the IEMB was fully autonomous, they now had the opportunity to elect their own bishop. But with this makeup of the assembly, it is not surprising that he was not a Bolivian. By a vote of 27 out of 60 votes, the new bishop was a mestizo, a Uruguayan named Mortimer Arias.
In 1962, Arias had been appointed to serve as a local pastor in the Bolivian Annual Conference after completing a 4-year term as bishop of the Uruguayan Annual Conference. He was a local pastor and district superintendent in Bolivia from 1962 until 1969. Bishop Arias had been strongly influenced by liberation theology while in seminary in Buenos Aires. Liberation theology was developed primarily by Roman Catholic priests working in South America. The emphasis was on God's role as the liberator of the oppressed and how God was always on the side of the poor and oppressed in this struggle to gain full human rights within their nation. Just as God had liberated the nomadic Jewish people from Egypt, so would God lead the Hispanic masses out from under the oppression of the descendants of the conquistadors and from oppression by the United States. An extremely important symbolic gesture by Bishop Arias, which meant a lot to the IEMB, the missionaries, and the indigenous, was that Bishop Arias decided he wanted to become a nationalized citizen of Bolivia. He used to tell funny stories about how difficult it was to even find a form to fill out and who to give it to in the government, or find anyone in the government who knew how to make a foreigner a nationalized citizen. No one had tried to become a Bolivian citizen in decades or longer. And I believe he did eventually accomplish that. And this was a great symbolic act of solidarity with the Bolivian people.
In economic terms, the autonomy was relative at best, because financially, the IEMB was still dependent upon the Methodist Church in the United States. In that sense, the IEMB continued being dependent in terms of economic resources and missionary personnel, even if it brought a form of paternalism. At that time, it was premature to do without the funds and U.S. personnel, as Reverend Arias pointed out, quote, "For a long time still, we will continue to need missionaries and resources," unquote. That is, in subsequent years, despite the effort for autonomy, the IEMB continued to be economically dependent and dependent upon American missionary personnel. Likewise, the ecclesiastical structure continued having notorious overtones of the old ecclesiastical power. The changes of independence did not allow complete autonomy, but only the beginning of a self-determination and the search for its own identity in Bolivian soil.
The basic structure of the new IEMB was identical to the United Methodist Church with a strong bishop. Bishop Arias appointed 4 U.S. missionaries to serve as executive secretaries of the IEMB, or what we would call the cabinet. No Bolivians were on the cabinet. He appointed 2 U.S. missionaries to be district coordinators of the largest 2 districts, and Mestizo pastors to serve as coordinators in other districts. The directors of the 7 American institutes were all U.S. missionaries. The other 46 U.S. missionaries were appointed as pastors in some capacity.
There were a total of 59 Methodist missionaries in Bolivia in 1969 who came from the United States, or Hispanics who came from South American countries. But there were only 1,427 members. That means that after 63 years of U.S. missionary work in Bolivia and the influx of all those missionaries, there were still only 24 members per missionary. That's a lot of money. Missionaries are expensive to maintain, and lots of staff for such meager results.
One other oddity that I noticed about the so-called autonomy of the IMB is that even as late as 1986, when I first went to Bolivia, the U.S. missionaries were not really under the control and direction of the bishop or the leadership of the IMB. Their assignment was determined by the General Board of Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church in New York, not by the bishop and executive committee of the IMB. They reported their work to the Bolivian leadership, but they had to justify their work to New York. Their assignment could be changed by GBGM, not by the IMB. The new projects and new missionaries were determined by GBGM, not by the IMB. The IMB could request a missionary for some specific task, but GBGM would interview the candidates and GBGM would select who would come, not the IMB. One of the commonalities that I have seen in the missionaries sent by GBGM to Bolivia since I've been involved with the IMB since 1987 is that U.S. bishops often send pastors who are unappointable in the United States. This would be pastors going through a nasty divorce,
or who have repeatedly struggled in several local churches.
Instead of going through the nasty process of removing them from the ministry, they often ship their problem pastor off to someone else to deal with. And if that pastor has any interest in missions, that's where they send them, out of the country and out of their mind. This has led to several U.S. missionaries come to Bolivia with deep scars which can show up in their ministry. But one of the running jokes in Bolivia is that the U.S. sends their divorced pastors to Bolivia so they can find a good Bolivian girl to marry. And it's surprising how many missionaries did just that and have lived happily ever after with their Bolivian wife. So while the IMB officially gained its autonomy from the United Methodist Church in 1969, it wasn't really completely independent. GBGM always had the threat to withhold their financial support and recall their missionaries, and they had the largest voting bloc within the IMB through the missionaries and their wives. As I said before, the indigenous churches were originally not allowed to use native instruments in worship, the charanga, pan flute, animal skin drums, etc., as they were considered music of the devil. However, in 1968, Hispanic Mestizo leadership within the church approved the creation of new hymns and a new Methodist hymnal, Bendice Dios a Bolivia, God Bless Bolivia. In 1968, Felipe and Pastor Felix Capriles co-wrote a Spanish Aymara hymn for the Kaya hymnal called, in Spanish, Acude Padre Dios, and in Aymara called Amatase Awakya. And in English it means, Remember Father God. It was later included in the Methodist hymnal. This is considered as the first Bolivian hymn, and the hymnal later was in 3 languages, Spanish, Aymara, and Quechua. The church was allowed to use the native instruments in worship beginning in 1969. The native instruments were included when the Kaya hymnal was released long before 1969 in some churches. The Kaya hymnal was an interdenominational hymnal oriented to the indigenous churches. Its first edition was only in Aymara. With the new indigenous pastors, the indigenous campesinos heard the gospel proclaimed in their own languages of Aymara and Quechua. With the new hymnal, they sang hymns in their own language and were accompanied by indigenous instruments.
One of the truly important accomplishments of the First General Assembly was the ordination of the first 7 indigenous pastors, and then they being appointed to serve churches. Most of the indigenous pastors got appointments to rural areas, of course, where almost all the church growth would come from in the next decade. The foresight of the previous Bishop Barbari in training these 7 indigenous pastors would prove critical to the future of the IEMB.
The sermons were now preached by persons who grew up in the indigenous reality of high infant mortality, no health care, and extreme poverty. The new indigenous pastors were from the people. They knew what life was on the Altiplano was like because they lived it. And they weren't persons who grew up in the extreme wealth of the United States or even the moderate wealth of the Hispanic Mestizo urban middle class. These indigenous pastors knew what the lives of the parishioners were truly like, and they preached God's love and God's concern for their lives. They found that the church was a place where they could speak about their sufferings and their anger, church fighting to make things better for the indigenous people. And the church began to grow and grow dramatically among the indigenous. The IEMB was becoming a rural indigenous church instead of an urban mestizo church. But the U.S. missionaries, the Hispanic mestizo middle-class clergy, and the Criollo laity living in the cities remained in firm control of the IEMB. The indigenous were second-class members of the church. Now, when the vast majority of your church membership makes less than $2 a day, you cannot expect much financial support from the membership. The IEMB was totally dependent upon the U.S. Methodist Church for financial support. This came in two forms: a generous grant from the General Board of Global Ministries, which paid for the salaries of the pastors, and the money then that was raised from U.S. Methodist churches and conferences and individuals by U.S. missionaries to fund specific projects like schools, hospitals, church construction, etc. GBGM saw the autonomy of the IEMB as an excuse to begin reducing its financial support of the IEMB and its institutions, with little consultation of the supposedly autonomous IEMB. The Aymara Girls' School was closed. The School of Nursing, started by Bessie Beck, was handed over to the local Bolivian university. These were all vital ministries to the indigenous people of Bolivia. GBGM also determined to stop U.S. funding of the American Institutes of La Paz and Cochabamba. However, the IEMB increased the class sizes through all the grade levels, which increased the tuition income and overcame the deficit. But the greatest loss was when it was decided that the Wesley Seminary in Montero, Bolivia, which was so vital to the future of the IEMB, was defunded and the buildings were given to the community. This key institution, which could have been so vital and so centered to the training of indigenous lay and clergy in spiritual growth and administration, was closed. This was a loss that has yet to be overcome. Despite the reduction in funding from the United States, the IEMB implemented new programs in rural medical clinics, adult education, teacher development, feeding programs for malnourished children, services to the homeless in El Alto, joint agricultural development with nonprofits like Heifer International and Save the Children and World Neighbors, and numerous other projects who serve not the middle class, but the poor. The IEMB truly penetrated the Campo indigenous population and began to have a real impact and improvement on the campesinos' health, diet, and education.
Methodists thought that autonomy, and with a liberation theology bishop, meant that now we will join with our Hispanic mestizo brothers and receive equality in the leadership of the church and become a truly Bolivian church, not a church of the North American missionaries. But as we will see, that is not what happened.
The U.S. continued to have an attitude of, quote, firm paternalism, unquote, as described by Delphine Quispe in the book that he edited, Historia de la Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia, 1906 to 2006, Una Iglesia Evangelica Inculturada.
GBGM was still deeply involved in the operations of the IEMB. Bishop Arias appointed 5 district coordinators. The 2 urban districts were led by Hispanic pastors, and the 3 small rural districts were headed by indigenous pastors. I'm not sure if the assembly elected or if the Bishop Arias appointed 12 national executive secretaries for areas such as Christian education, evangelism, rural work, etc. These would be good positions to put in people who needed to learn how to lead and to organize the church. 11 of the national executive secretaries chosen by the assembly or by Bishop Arias were Hispanic mestizo pastors and laity. 1 was the wife of a missionary. Not 1 was indigenous. Not 1. The assembly also commissioned 59 missionary workers, mostly from the United States. Each one was assigned to run an educational institution hospital, or work in some other national capacity. There were 46 U.S. missionaries who were members of the last 1969 annual conference, but some of them, as I mentioned before, were not seminary trained, but were the wives of a seminary trained missionary. Now, I don't know all these people, but I've run a list of persons appointed to leadership positions in 1969 by several people who were there, and this is my best understanding of how many fully indigenous were appointed. 3. Now, there may have been some urban, middle-class indigenous persons who identified themselves more with the Mestizo population rather than their indigenous roots. But of the fully indigenous Methodists that were appointed, there were only 3. So with about 80 or so leadership positions available within the newly independent IEMB, 3 indigenous were appointed to leadership positions. And those positions were district coordinators in extremely rural indigenous areas. That's it, just 3.
And so the stage is set for confrontation. There's an indigenous growing majority chafing from their lack of inclusion in leadership and decision-making. There's the U.S., South American, and Bolivian Criollo pastors and laity who, in their heart of hearts, don't have anything against the indigenous, except they just felt that the indigenous weren't ready, educated, or trained for leadership. And to be honest, they weren't in a big hurry to train them. Something had to change. Our next episode will continue the march toward true autonomy and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia.
I have many sources who have passed down information to me. The 3 books that were most crucial to my work has been the History of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia, 1906 to 2006, the Enculturated Evangelical Church Compiler Investigator Delphine Quispe in 2006, the paper The Mission of the Methodist Church Becomes a Part of the Historical Fabric in Bolivia, From Education with the Indigenous People, Weaving the Multicolored Aguayo by Gustavo Loza, which was written in Cochabamba in July of 2007. And I am deeply indebted to Pascual Mamani Luqui's book, The History of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia, in the first century anniversary, 1906-2006, for its list of attendees and appointments at each annual conference and General Assembly. I also have dozens of cassette, mini cassette, and electronic recordings of interviews and many pages of notes taken from interviews with people who were involved in the Aymara Revolution and who knew a lot about it. I will have a list of all those recordings and persons that I've interviewed on the website.